Good evening, friends. Thank you for being here today. It's great to be back in Austin. I was here a couple of months ago for a conference and I loved it here. Even though I'm a vegetarian and even though I'm from the Bay Area, but it was awesome. So I'm glad to be back here and just we'll start with a quick introduction. I'm Shweta Khandelwal. I'm the principal attorney and the owner at my firm, the Law Office of Shweta Khandelwal, based out of Santa Clara, California. I practice immigration law, so that's a federal practice, which means that I pretty much work with clients across the US. I'm an immigrant myself. I've been here on practically every visa possible, from H1, H4, OPT, F1, finally got my green card, and now I'm self-employed. I'm currently the chair of the Silicon Valley chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and something there tells you my approximate age as well. So the objective of this session today is essentially to understand how US immigration laws intersect with entrepreneurship. And it'll give you an overview of the various visas, both temporary and permanent, that are available for foreigners, especially entrepreneurs, who would like to come here, start their own businesses, and eventually get to hire top talent irrespective of nationality. And importantly, it'll also, my objective is to help you understand and appreciate how seemingly small changes in fact patterns and situations can actually affect the visa options that are available for you. It's just a quick disclaimer. Okay, so before we proceed, just to get a sense of the audience, a quick poll. Anyone here who's a US citizen? Okay. People on temporary visas, H1s, too many, okay. Nationality, by H1s, L1s, any other temporary non-immigrant visa. Okay. Nationality, India, China. Okay. Any European nations? Okay. Students? Okay, so that will just help me sort of as we move along. Okay, and more curious, people who are founders, CEOs, entrepreneurs, started their own businesses, planning to start their own businesses. Good question. Okay, so we'll briefly talk a little about, this is the roadmap for our presentation. Okay, why immigration? Pretty much, so we all know 25% of high-tech companies founded between 95 and 2005 had at least one immigrant founder. I guess that's not an alien concept to us, especially high-tech. Almost you'll find several companies with foreigners as founders or as employees. And why is it important for them to be on the right visa? Absolutely, if you're here to ensure continuity of the operations, to ensure that the business can carry on, without interruption, it's absolutely critical for founders to be here on the right work visa and eventually to be able to hire top global talent. Now, what's the sort of relationship between entrepreneurs and USCIS? USCIS is the agency that is responsible for adjudicating visa petitions. It is the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. So it was about a couple of years ago that USCIS launched its Entrepreneurs in Residence initiative, where it essentially promised us that it's going to take a better look at the visa petitions that are being filed by entrepreneurs. So now we traditionally know that all the laws that are there are essentially laws which are a little archaic when it comes to applying them to modern businesses. These are laws that have been existing forever, and now to adapt them to the modern way of doing business, that is what USCIS promised they will do when they launched their EIR, the Entrepreneurs in Residence program. So they kind of call for stakeholder meetings, policy meetings, invite feedback from entrepreneurs to see how they can actually better apply their laws in tune with how modern businesses do. I mean, it doesn't always help, but they've promised that they will. So let's see how does it go. Now, how does that impact the way impact attorneys as well as the beneficiaries of these visa petitions. This is the key. Because there are no standardized regulations, or because there is no standardized way of applying these laws, we have to get creative. Every business is unique. No business is repetitive or duplicative of another. So every business is unique. It has its own strengths. It has its own weaknesses. So the way we apply the laws to them will also depend upon the strengths of our business. So the most important thing when you are petitioning yourself as a founder or as an entrepreneur when it comes, is to be creative and get creative. Try to customize your visa application, or ensure that your visa application is actually customized to your business. There is no one size fits all model. There is no cookie cutter approach that will apply to all businesses. You just have to get smart and creative to figure out which options work for you, and even within these options, how best to present your case. And for this particular reason, it's important that you structure your businesses accordingly. We'll talk about it a little more when we talk about the individual visas, and plan really ahead. I cannot overemphasize how important it is to really, step back, see how your business, how you want to see your business grow, and plan to see what are the options that will be available for you. The problems that we have, as I said, there are no standardized ways of applying laws. Laws themselves have gray areas. And unfortunately, the best immigration decisions do not make best business decisions. So the government wants a way of seeing things done, and that is generally not the way real life business decisions have to be made. But we sort of have to strike a balanced approach. So we'll now discuss the key non-immigrant or the temporary work visas that are available. Again, I'm trying, because just based on the audience profile, I'm trying to steer the direction towards people who want to start their own businesses and who are here on temporary visas or want to be here on temporary visas. But all these visas can also be used to hire people. If you have a business, if you are a US citizen who manages his or her own business, these are the potential visas that you can use to get foreign nationals on board. Then we'll talk about the key non-immigrant or temporary visas. We'll discuss some immigrant visas, which are popularly called the green cards. And we'll apply all that we have here to a case study, which will have various facts, various scenarios, and that will sort of help us appreciate how these different fact patterns actually go on to impact the decisions that we make. So, any questions so far? We'll have room for Q&A too, but okay. So the temporary non-immigrant visa options. These are called temporary because these are non-immigrant visas. There are 6 major categories of visas that are there that we'll discuss here. There are those which are mainly used by most entrepreneurs and businesses to hire foreign talent. The first 3 are the visitor's visa, the B1 visa, and the visa waiver program. You have the student visa, the F1, and the optional practical training program. The investor visas, and visas for investors and your employees. Intercompany transfer L1 visas, the professional worker H1B visa, and the extraordinary ability or the O1 visa. So I will discuss each of these in detail, but for now, this sort of summarizes the purpose and the applicability for each of these. The B1 visa and the visa waiver program. So this is a visa, it's a temporary visa, it's called a temporary visa for temporary visitors for business. They are used for limited purposes, both B1 and the visa waiver program. So the visa waiver program essentially implies that people who are from the participating countries, they don't really need a visa to enter the US. As long as you have a machine-readable passport, you can use that to enter and exit the US. While the visa is something that you will specifically go to the US consulate abroad to procure. So these are visas used for limited purposes. Examples are here: negotiate contracts, attend meetings, participate in seminars, discussions, conduct research. Whether it's the B1 or the visa waiver program, the purpose is the same. The consequence of the visa waiver program, there is a limit to the number of days that you can be in the US, which is 90 days. And if you enter the US on a visa waiver, you cannot change your status to any other status. You have to leave the country and then re-enter US on the right appropriate visa. While if you're on the B1 already, you can change your status from the B1 to another visa without having to leave the US. So it's mainly a matter of administrative convenience, whether you really want to leave the country or you want to continue being here. So the most important thing you need to show is a non-immigrant intent, meaning you must convince the consulate that you do not have the intent to immigrate to the US, to move to the US. You must demonstrate that you have sufficient ties to your home country and that you will return to your home country once the purpose of your stay is over. You cannot be employed in the US, cannot be remunerated for any work that you do, which is remuneration by itself does not mean employment, but the thing is you cannot do anything which involves gainfully being employed in the US.
Can I ask a quick question about that?
Yes, sure.
What does in the US mean?
In the US means within the territorial waters of US for a US business here.
If I have a business that's registered somewhere else and I get a paycheck from it while I'm here doing consulting work, why is that?
So as long as you're being paid by the overseas company and not being paid by any US business.
Oh, that's easy though.
No, you're not working here. So you're not kind of consulting here and getting paid for it elsewhere. So if you're working for a US company, you are performing work here. So you can enter for a temporary purpose. Let's say you can if you're here on a 6-month assignment and you're engaged in work and just, the company sort of overcomes it by paying you a salary abroad. No, that's not acceptable. The idea is the purpose behind what you are here. You cannot be like engaged on there are alternatives to that. We have alternatives to the B1. We have the B1 instead of in lieu of H1. There are other visas that are used when you have to come here to work, but it cannot be the B1. So we'll talk about it later when we come to the case scenarios. So you cannot be employed and you cannot be working for a US company. You cannot be sort of engaged in a project here and be providing consulting services. So you should see employment in context of the purpose for which the visas are being issued. Negotiating a contract, attending a meeting, meeting your associates, conducting any research. It's convenient, it's economical, it's quick, it's great during early planning. You want to come, can we take Q&As later? It'll just be more convenient. So it's great during early planning stages when you're sort of, looking out for investors, say. That's a great purpose for which you can come here. What sucks about it is the law itself is not clear as to what activities are permitted and what are not. The Foreign Affairs Manual specifically says it's sometimes hard to identify whether a particular activity actually involves working in the US or not. So we have gray areas in law. And again, if a B1 is denied at the consulate, there is nothing you can do. You cannot appeal it. You just reapply and just hope you get lucky. So that's the first temporary visa. We'll now talk a little about the student visa, the F1 and the OPT program. The people who are eligible would be anybody who's studying full-time in a US accredited university. Graduates, undergrads, PhDs, whatever the program be. Now generally, there is no employment while the student is working in school. Whatever employment is usually post-completion of the program. But after completion, you actually get 12 months of optional practical training. That's a 12-month work permit that the student is free to work for any company, any employer, any number of employers, any number of hours, multiple employers, part-time, full-time, whatever. There is an additional 17-month employment over and above the 12 months that is available to STEM graduates. STEM graduates would be graduates of science, technology, engineering, math. So these students actually get an additional 17 months training after 12, which makes it a total of 29 months of work permit, which is awesome. Of course, as I said, you have to complete your academic program. The other thing is the importance of accredited, reputed schools. Even being accredited is not enough. There's been a lot of issues with schools which have designed their curriculums solely to accommodate students who want optional practical training or curricular practical training. And USCIS has got down really, really heavily on them. So again, ensure that the schools that you are, associated with are reputed and accredited. STEM OPT students cannot be out of jobs for more than 90 days. If you're out of job for 90 days or more, you automatically lose your OPT period. And any STEM extension that you apply for, that has to be applied while your current OPT is pending. So you cannot let your OPT lapse. You cannot let your 12-month OPT lapse to apply for the STEM extension. What's great? It's a great option, especially for people who want to have, a lot of engineering, especially here in Austin, in the Valley. You have so many students, high tech, they want to start their own companies. They want to see what potential they have for their idea to succeed. It's an awesome 29-month opportunity that they have to start and take their companies forward. There is no minimum wage requirement, unlike some other visas, which requires the company to pay a minimum salary to the foreign national. With the OPTs, there is no such minimum wage, though you might have some issues with your respective state laws, because that there may be a potential there. So working for free or hiring someone for no pay may have implications in the respective employment laws for the state, but as far as federal immigration practice is concerned, you're not required to pay them any minimum salary. And there is a situation called the cap gap that we'll discuss when we discuss the H-1B visas. That is going to that pretty much gets solved. So just to quickly touch upon it, cap gap is a situation when a student who is currently on OPT is now applying for an H-1B visa, another category of non-immigrant visa. So there is a gap actually between the time when the OPT period ends and the time when the H-1 actually comes into effect. So the cap gap ensures that the OPT student can continue to work even though he or she does not have work authorization until the beginning of the H-1B period, which is actually a great thing. It's really convenient, because otherwise the student would be forced to leave employment and come back, leave the country and come back when the H-1 kicks into effect. We'll talk about it a little more when we discuss H-1 visas. What sucks? I think nothing. OPT is awesome. It really is 29 months of a work permit for you to use as you wish. Work for the employer of your choice, work for multiple employers. It's for 29 months, but enough to sort of give you enough time for you to know where you or the company has to move on next. And just as long as you sort of stay within status, don't be without a job for the 90-day period. Apply for extensions timely. You're good. Yes.
For how long you have to be a full-time student to be considered for the OPT?
Yes. You
For
have to
how
be a
long?
full-time. You have to complete the duration of your program. Whatever, you cannot get OPT unless you've completed the duration of the program. There are alternatives. You have something called a curricular practical training, which allows you to work while you're in school, but that training is only if the program is incidental to the course of work. And that's again limited for 20 hours. So,
Okay.
but you have to be a full-time student and you have to complete your program to be eligible for
Exactly.
OPT.
One employer, for example, I know somebody that's been trying to get into that, but he's consulting for 5 or 6 startups. He's a techie. Is that acceptable?
This person is on OPT?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's acceptable. As I said, there is no restriction on the number of employers you can work for, the number of hours you can work. Yes.
As an MBA student, do you fall into the STEM thing?
No, you don't.
You don't have those 17
No,
months?
you don't have the additional. So MBA students have only 12 months of OPT. You have to be a STEM. And again, with STEM, you can only use STEM for, as I said, for E-verified companies. So the company E-verify is a way by employers have to sort of register themselves with the federal authorities. So only those companies which are actually E-verified can hire STEM students.
But there's no self-employment on that STEM extension.
You can start your own company, E-verify it, and then be employed by it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes.
Can you start your own company for the OPT?
Yes, absolutely you can. So that's you can. OPT allows you to. When I say it's an option for entrepreneurs, it means that once you've completed your program, you can start your own company, work for your own company, not to be paid in terms of a regular salary by your own company or work for unlimited hours for your own company. You can start to if you wish. So that's okay. Okay, visas for investors and their employees, which is the E2. There are people from European countries here, right? So the E2 visa is actually available to nationals whose countries have a treaty with the United States. So now United States has a treaty with about 55 countries, which is called the Treaty of Friendship, Navigation and Commerce. And only if you're a national from any one of those 55 countries are you eligible for the E visa. Bad news, there is no treaty between US and India, there is no treaty between US and China. So these two most problematic situations sort of don't have an option or no recourse.
Mexico, does Mexico have it?
Yes, Mexico has it. So it is eligible for an investor who wishes to develop and direct his business, or an executive manager or a critical employee or an employee who has specialized knowledge of that e-business. The treaty nationals must own at least 50% of the business. They must also control the business. Generally, all nationals must be from the same treaty country, and if two nationalities are involved, both must have equal ownership and control. Sort of just pretty much summarizes the requirements as far as nationality and ownership and control is. So it's a small distinction, but an important and a useful one, that the owners need not necessarily be the same people who are actually controlling the business. Okay, so the ownership requirement is a requirement that is used to determine nationality. So it is the first part. If you, as long as the company is owned by a treaty national, you would be eligible for the E, even though those owners are not the ones who are actually managing the enterprise. So that's a distinction. We'll come to it again, and we'll be able to appreciate it better when we do the case. But that's helps to know. Yes.
When you say treaty nationals must own at least 50% of the business, can it be treaty nationals of different?
Yeah, no, so that's if two, generally all nationals, so if you are two French, two Germans, you can collectively form a business of three. But if there are more than two, then each nationality has to have equal ownership and control. So if you have, say, Belgium and you have French, so and you have just one Belgian national and two French nationals, the Belgian national has to be 50% owner and the French nationals have to be 50% owners. So you have to have equal ownership and control if people from two nationalities. We'll, when we come to the case study, we'll actually do all these potential scenarios and see how we can overcome them by all the visa options that we have. Yes?
Will it be better to apply to E2 or use the OPT?
It depends. If you OPT means you actually are enrolled in a full-time academic program, right? Yeah, so again, we'll sort of do a comparative analysis. You can start with the OPT and then eventually move on to the E, depending on whether you'll require. So when we do the requirements for the E visas, you'll be able to figure out better whether the OPT is a better option for you or the E. So we'll come to it. So the investment, now E is an investor visa. E2 is an investor visa, which means that you require some green, right? So it's an investment which must be at risk, which means is you have to demonstrate that you have irrevocably committed a certain amount of money to risk. If the business fails, you tend to lose that money. Just merely parking the money in a bank account is not sufficient to get you a visa. You have to show how that money has actually engaged. You've probably leased space, you've bought equipment, you've negotiated with suppliers, vendors, an active process of investing. So you probably can sort of set up money in an escrow and hope to work it out that way. But what is important is that you have to demonstrate that the money has been committed to the business.
It's kind of a chicken and egg, though, isn't it? I'm not.
It actually is. It is a chicken and the egg situation in the sense that you will not continue to be in the business, but you have to show that so that's why you do the escrow arrangements, just to overcome that potential chicken and egg situation. But the idea is just that if you buy, let's say if you buy a piece of real estate and park it and say, I've invested $100,000, that's not an active investment.
Yeah.
That's the idea. Yes.
A commercial property would be.
Again, how are you engaging in it? If it's just if you are in the business of real estate and you have bought real estate, a couple of properties which is inventory, which is not just an asset, then maybe it can.
How does that work with private equity if you're investing in securities in the States?
No, it has to be a business. It has to be a business. It cannot be just an equity invest. That's not running and actively. Let me look at the other requirements and that'll answer your question.
Is Hungary one of the countries?
I think it is, but I'll need to check up the list and let you. The list is actually there on the U.S. Department of State website, so it's always available. Okay, so the business that you are engaged in must be substantial. What it means is it must be a business that is giving you more than a marginal return. It cannot be a business which you are starting just to eke out a living for yourself. You have to show that the business has the potential to grow. It has probably the potential to hire more people. It is something more than just more than just a meager livelihood for the investor. So it is a substantial. How do you decide that? Again, you sort of see the nature of the business. You see, where the scale of the business, and other factors. You need a great, solid business plan that is able to demonstrate that you're meeting all the requirements. The source of funds for the business must, of course, be legitimate. But what is important is you actually need to trace the way the money is coming from. So gifts, salary is fine. Any money that you have earned in US is actually fine. The money does not have to come from an overseas source, as long as it is earned by the foreign national. So let's say if you are a German citizen who's working in the US on an H-1 visa, have saved money over a period of years, and now want to start a business, that's fine, even though the money has come from the US source. You can't take loans that are secured by the business. The loans have to be secured by the personal assets of the investor. The investor has to be personally, it's a loan for which he or she is personally liable. Loans which are raised on the security of the business are not acceptable. What's great, these are just, it's designed to give you an overview of the visa more than go into individual intricacies of each element, but these are basically some of the key requirements that must be fulfilled for you to be eligible for the E1, What's great about it is that there is no high threshold investment. What it means is that there are some particular investor visas which require the investor to invest at least $1 million or at least $500,000. Here, there is no such minimum amount. Traditionally, people think that there is no magic number that will work, as long as you're able to demonstrate that this kind of business requires this kind of capital. So it should be in relation to the business. Now, if you're setting up a car, an automobile plant, you'll obviously need millions of dollars. But if you're setting up if it's a high-tech business, but most people, actually what they need is a laptop, right? Nothing more. So you are able to demonstrate that this is all that is required for a business of this kind. Now, again, to be fair, it's not that USCIS always buys this argument. I would say money speaks, so the more you have it, the better it looks. But there is no. So you are able to, there have been case precedents where even an amount of investment of $15,000 to $20,000 has worked, because you are able to meet the burden of proof that this is the amount that is sufficient for a business of this nature. You can even use intangible assets if you can properly, if you can value them well. If you have a patent or a technology, anything that you think you can get an expert opinion and assign a value to it, so that can also contribute as an investment towards the business. I mean, there's a lot of things or expenses that many entrepreneurs incur without realizing, but they can all be added on to show that these are the investments they've already made in the business. For instance, frequent trips to the US. You keep traveling over a period of months. All travel bills, all hotel bills can all be added on to show that these are the expenses you've already incurred towards setting up your business. And a spouse of an E2 can work, which is quite good. You'll see from the other visas, some of them don't have that option. What sucks is the biggest problem for E2s, especially when it comes to entrepreneurs today, is VC funding. Because the moment you get outside money in, then the stake of maintaining that 50% will get affected, will get compromised. So whenever you're looking to raise money from outside, that's probably the time when you know that the E is no longer going to work for you. So as long as you're able to stick to that 50% ownership, that's when your E is good. When you find yourself beyond, kind of struggling with that, that's the time to let the E go. Again, there is no set minimum investment, which is good, but it's also unclear because we really don't know what numbers are we working against. We really don't know whether an investment of $50,000 is enough for us to qualify, for us to argue before USCIS that this amount is enough for this particular kind of business. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, there is no checklist. There is no black or white. It's as I said, get creative, get smart, and just do smart lawyering. So there are no standards. And the E does not allow a visa holder to have an immigrant intent. What it means is that there is no path to a green card if you're on the E visa. You can be on the E visa forever. You can be on the E visa indefinitely as long as your business continues to meet those requirements for the E visa. But if you're looking to move on to being a permanent resident as an E investor, that's not going to happen. So you have to find a way to move yourself to any other non-immigrant visa before you move towards a green card.
Does having an E2 visa actually help you though? Saying that you're already established
Help me where?
as far as getting an immigration.
No, you cannot have an immigrant intent because if you want to if you want a green card, if you want to find a way to become a permanent resident, you have to move out of the E because the E does not give you the option to have the intent to immigrate. There are some visas which are called dual intent visas, like the H-1B or the L-1. They allow you to have an intent to immigrate. The student visa, the F1, which we discussed a short while ago, the B1, the E's, these visas do not allow you to hold an immigrant intent. Which is kind of, it may be funny, all students here who come, eventually all of them find jobs and eventually all of them get green cards, right? But when they apply for their F1 visa, when they apply for their student visa at the consulate, they are required to show that they do not have the intent to immigrate, which explains why we all need immigration reform. But till we don't have it, we just go with what we have. Okay, so, yeah, we just talked about the E.
Can a spouse hold a green card intent or an application?
The spouse, as long as you are not a beneficiary of that application. So if your spouse has a green card, but you are on E, that's fine.
No, what my question was, if I start a company and my wife has the authorization to work, can she carry the intent of applying for a green card under her?
Yes, she can. If she has a green card, she can actually be working for your company. But you should not be the beneficiary of an immigrant petition. Your spouse can.
But I'll be able to get a green card if she gets it as a dependent.
It sort of sounds illogical, but yes, you can. Then you move out of the E. Then you don't need the E. If you already have a green card, then there is no reason for you to do the E, right? You can.
There is no green card. My question was, because from my understanding, a spouse has the authorization to work,
Right.
while the other spouse has the E2, correct?
Right.
So during that period, if the wife
No,
is
so here is what I think I got your question. So this situation is when I'm saying a spouse of an E2 can work, what it means is the spouse of an E2 holder who comes as a dependent, he or she is authorized to work. Okay, like the H1, a spouse of an H1B holder who comes as an H4 holder on an H4 visa is not allowed to work, cannot apply for a work permit. But a spouse of an E2 can apply for a work permit.
But that does not lead to a green card.
Yes, that does not lead to a green card.
Okay.
That does not lead to a green card.
It's just the work authorization as a dependent.
Yes, they have a work authorization that they can use to work for any company. They're entitled to apply for a work authorization. Any questions? Okay, so the L1. So this is an intercompany transfer visa. It's called the L1. It allows a foreign business a foreign business can set up a business in the US, which is a US affiliated business. The relationship between the foreign business and the US business is defined in law. It's what we call their affiliates. So what it means is a foreign, it can be a holding subsidiary relationship. It can be that you have a same group of shareholders who hold majority shares in both companies. Whatever your affiliate relationship is, there are limited ways in which you can have it, and you must have it if you want to be eligible for, if the employee of the overseas company needs to be eligible for an L1 visa. Now, whoever is seeking to apply for the L1, the foreign national must be employed by the overseas business for at least 1 year out of the preceding 3 years. So this is a non-negotiable requirement. If you have an overseas company and you want to send an employee of that company to the US, that employee must have worked with the overseas company for at least 1 year in the preceding 3 years before he or she can be eligible for the L1. Even an owner, if say you are an entrepreneur, you've got a business in France and you want to sort of come and set up an office or a branch or an affiliate of that business in the US, even owners can set up L1s, so can come on L1s, though that is a little more challenging. And L1s are of, you have an L1 for a new office versus an L1 for an established office. What this means is that if you have an overseas business and you're looking to set up a new office in the US, it's a brand new office, you can apply for an L1 which is approved for 1 year only. But when you have an already established office in the US, which is related to the US office, to the overseas office, you get an L1 for 3 years. So that's the other reason is a new office L1 is sort of a lot more challenging to get approved than for an established office, but it's there. What it takes to succeed, the eligibility requirements, these are absolutely critical, non-negotiable. The documentation has to be perfect for them to approve your case. Both foreign company, US company must be in business. You cannot set up an office outside and transfer yourself here and then shut the business there. No, your business overseas and in the US must be active, must be in existence. What's great, I think it's a great option for overseas companies. Many entrepreneurs, they already do start something back in their home country. They're just looking for a way to sort of move, expand their presence globally, move to the US. It's an awesome option for them. There is no minimum salary requirement. So as entrepreneurs, you're bootstrapped, you don't want to pay yourself a very high salary, the L1 is a great option because the law does not provide for any minimum salary for an L1 employee. In fact, you can actually be working, one of you had the question as to whether can you be working overseas, being paid overseas, you actually can. So an L1 employee can be paid by the overseas company while he or she is working in the US company.
Why doesn't he need a working visa if he's getting paid by the overseas?
No, but he's working here. He's working here to set up the US establishment. He's working here to manage the US businesses because but the US company, because it's also the relationship, right? Maybe the US company is just a branch of the overseas company. It does not run separate payroll here. In that case, it will be the overseas company which is doing. So you have the option. Whether you take it or not, that's a different story. Okay. A lot of CEOs, can I just complete and then I'll come back to you. A lot of CEOs, they want to move around between the overseas company and the US company. They have global operations. They want to be able to manage both. So L1 gives them that flexibility to move. So as long as the majority of the time you are spending in the US doing what you're supposed to do as per the visa, it's fine if you was out for a couple of months looking at business overseas. Yes, someone had a question.
Yeah, is there a minimum investment?
That's a good question. We'll talk about it. Actually, L1s do not have a minimum investment. There is no minimum investment in law. Now, just to give you a practical example, let's say you have an overseas company and they want to set up 100% or at least a wholly owned subsidiary in the US, right? So what it means is that the overseas company, the foreign company, is acquiring the shares of the US company. If you're able to demonstrate that the value of those shares, let's say is just whatever, less than a cent or let's 0.01 cent per share, and the overseas company is spending like $5,000 to acquire 50,000 shares. As long as you can justify that's the valuation of the company, even $5,000 is enough to set up. Actually, even $2,000 is enough to set up an investment. But as long as you're able to demonstrate the relationship requirements, you're able to demonstrate that this is what the company is actually valued at, there is no minimum amount. Because the amount will really depend on how valuable the companies are and how the relationship between the two companies are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so for example, a startup based in Mexico,
Right.
they wanna come here.
So, okay, I'll give you an example. Let's say you are a product company, right? You are building a product. At this point, you really don't have, what's the most valuable asset that you have? The product that you have. At this point, how much do you think the company is valued at? Probably not much, right? So you get a report from a CPA or a evaluation or whatever, that this is what you set up an office here, how much, let's say you need some reasonable amount of money to maintain day-to-day operations of the company. But at the end, you should be able to make a convincing case that this is the amount that you have to manage the office. You have enough to incur office expenses. You likely generate some revenue from the sale of the product or the service or whatever it is that you have. So it all goes on to how great a story you can sell. Right? Like how comprehensive your whole, there may not be a requirement in terms of money or investment, but there has to be something else in your petition that makes you appear like a bona fide, genuine petition. Make sense?
One more question.
Yes.
Okay, the startup applies for the
You
L1
dropped your
visa.
business card there for the raffle. Yes. Okay, yeah, sure.
So the startup applies for the L1 visa. How many employees can that startup bring with it?
We'll talk about it. When we talk about the different kinds of visas, we'll talk about it.
Okay.
Yes.
If somebody comes in with an L1 visa, how much time does he have to spend in the US in order to apply for a green card?
That's a good question. We can talk about it when we do green cards as well. Or actually, you don't have to spend any time on the L1 to apply for a green card. The green card.
You have to spend about 1 year.
No. So here is the requirements, the eligibility requirements. Whether you are doing the L1 or you're doing the green card, the corresponding category of green cards for L1s is the same. So you don't have to be on a temporary visa to be able to apply for a non-immigrant visa. This will take us sort of beyond the trajectory of the discussion, but we can.
But if you have a L1 visa and let's say
you can apply for the green card immediately.
You come in the next day.
You can, absolutely you can. That's not the point as to how can you apply. What is the more important question is whether in the totality of circumstances, looking at the facts of the case, do you think you have a case which is strong enough for the green card to get approved? Simply because when it comes to green cards, the burden of proof and the eligibility requirements are much higher than when it comes to L1s. USCIS scrutinizes an immigrant visa application far stronger than it does a non-immigrant visa application. So if you're a brand new company and you don't have much to show for and your product is, so it'll sort of question the ability whether the company really has the potential to support this green card application. But when it comes to an L1, they are more likely to be, I wouldn't use the word lenient, but they are much more likely to take it easier than it is to take a green
But some
card.
other company would be easier for, let's say, a 3-4 year old company.
It depends how well the company is doing. I mean, these are, like, as I said, just because there is no minimum salary requirement for you to pay the foreign national does not mean that there is no minimum salary requirement to get the green card. So I'm trying to sort of build the discussion around the fact that what are the visas that are likely to make it easy for foreign entrepreneurs to come, start their businesses, see how it grows. So, I mean, some requirements may be more stringent than the others, but this is enough for you to come, get your feet wet and get yourself up and running to see how the business is likely to move. Make sense? So even, let's say for an L1, you have an overseas company which is well established, right? It has decent revenue, it has decent turnover, it's doing well, whereas a US company is brand new. But if I was arguing a case, I would see, look, this US company is well backed. It's well funded by an established overseas company which has so much in revenue or in turnover, or it has so many customers, or it has a product that is already doing well in the market. So it's sort of more likely to give them a reason to approve your application for you to come and test your idea here in the US. That's the reason you apply for the new office L1. When you're looking to start a new office, that's the time when USCIS is more likely to give you an opportunity than when you already have an established business. Okay, we'll talk about these a little more when we do the slides. Okay, what sucks for L1s? L1s for owners and small businesses are hard. They're harder to approve for than for regular businesses. So the other thing which might be relevant, there are two kinds of L1 visas. You actually have the L1A visa, which is a visa for executives and managers. And you have an L1B visa, which is a visa for specialized knowledge individuals. That means those individuals who have a specialized knowledge of the company's products or processes or technology that is not likely to be available outside in the US. So if you are an entrepreneur, or if you've developed a product, or you are a technology guy who's designed an algorithm or built an app or whatever, you can argue that you are a specialized knowledge employee because that knowledge which is attributable to you for the product is proprietary to the company, right? You can't easily find it out elsewhere. So that's a specialized knowledge individual. A manager or an executive is someone who will come here and manage people or manage the business. So the L1As are the ones, regarding your question for green cards, the L1As are the people who are eligible for a green card under the EB1 route. L1Bs are not, okay? So if you are coming on an L1A, you technically are already eligible to apply for the green card. But the reason, whether you should apply or not would really depend upon the facts of the case. Whether it's an established company, whether you can still apply, but unless
if they turn you down, you can apply again.
You can apply again and again. If they love your money, you can apply as many times as you do. Yes. Okay, so this is the L1 for owners and small businesses, a little more challenging than the L1s. So for larger and more established businesses, but still it's an option. And an interesting challenge, at least for a lot of L1, for a lot of entrepreneurs who are working overseas, is they are usually not drawing any salary. So many entrepreneurs, they don't want to pay themselves a salary. So that sort of becomes a little hard when you're trying to demonstrate the 1 year working requirement, because pay slips, if you don't have pay slips, how do you sort of prove that the guy was working or the person was working for 1 year? So that's something that if you can afford to pay yourself a salary, you should. If for no other reason, then for the L1. Okay, the H1 work visa, this is the most popular and category of all visas that most people sort of want to know more about. It's a visa for professionals. It's a visa that requires the position to be a specialty occupation, which means that the position must require at least a bachelor's degree. And the visa is tied to the sponsor company, the company that is filing the petition. For entrepreneurs, what it takes to succeed is an organization structure that establishes an employer-employee relationship between the US business and the foreign national, and proof that there is enough work for the duration of the petition, and again, a great story. So, what's great about the H-1B visa? Once a person is on an H-1B visa, they can change between employers relatively easy. You can be a part-time H-1, full-time H-1. What sucks, there are a limited number of H-1Bs available. There are actually 60,000 available every year, an additional 20,000 if you have a master's from a US university. The numbers run up really fast. Last year, the numbers were over in 5 days. This year, we anticipate the numbers will be over in probably a week too. The relationship, the employer-employee relationship. So what you're required to demonstrate, is that the company and the H-1 visa holder They have an employer-employee relationship. That means the company has the authority to hire, fire the employee, supervise the employee, control the employee, which becomes hard when it's your own company, right? Though, I mean, we still argue and we use corporate law arguments to overcome that challenge, but it's always a challenge. Again, if you're yes.
So for the L1 visa, is there a tie between the person and the company?
There is a tie there too. You cannot work for any other company if you're on the L1 because you are actually it's within the company. The reason I've put it here is we'll sort of go it when we come to the quota because of the limited number of visas that are available every year. If you miss the numbers this year, you miss it. You miss the bus, right? You have to wait for your turn next year. But if you get through the quota and if you are allotted an H1 visa, now you're free to change your employer.
And the L1 also?
No, not the L1. The L1 cannot be moved to any other because it's an intra-company. It's only for the employees of the same company. Any other company
Let's say the
cannot.
L1, the American company is bankrupt and it's whatever, then you have to go back.
You have to go back. Or you go back to another branch of, but of course that will not be the L1. Yes, but you have to go back. If you're working in the US, you'll have to go back, yeah. What's SAC? Okay, the minimum specialty occupation for CEOs. Most people, especially CEOs, they want to call themselves CEOs. They don't want to go with any other title. That's sort of a challenge because it's sometimes hard to establish that the specialty occupation, that the CEO position of a CEO is a specialty occupation. The minimum.
Realize how ridiculous that is?
Pardon me?
Does anybody in immigration realize how ridiculous that is?
I do. The minimum salary. We actually have ways to sort of deal with these situations. They don't always work, but most of the times, as I said, if you can sell a great story, it works. The minimum salary requirement is high, so the H1 employees are required to be paid a certain minimum salary, which is based on the position, the title, the duties, and the geographical location. Sometimes this can be pretty prohibitive, and the spouse on an H1 cannot work.
What do you mean by the blue square, the Mexican things?
Yeah, I'll come to it. Okay, let me just quickly summarize the H1 and then I'll talk about it. So the H1, the problem with H1, the biggest problem is a limited number of H1 visas available. You have 60,000 H1 visas available each year. The quota for it opens on April 1st. So your applications have to be in on April 1st. But if you're approved, you do not start working until October of that year. So you have to plan well enough in advance if you want to come on H1. Because of the limited number of visas, it's sort of first come, first served. As soon as the 60 or 80 visa numbers are exhausted, you miss it. There's no other. Then you figure whether the L or the O or whatever else works for you. Specialty occupation, the position must require a bachelor's degree. It's not hard to establish that CEOs usually have a bachelor's degree. You cannot perform complex functions without a bachelor's degree. But what you need to sort of sell is that the duties are complex, irrespective of what the title or whatever it is. The duties are sufficiently complex and only people with a bachelor's degree can perform those duties. If you recall, about a couple of years earlier, the CEO of a company called Cruisewise, whose H1 was actually denied, and he went back to Canada because apparently USCIS told him that the position is not a specialty occupation.
That was the Israeli guy, right?
Pardon me?
The Israeli guy from
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So he had good PR working for him, so he really used it to his advantage. Then limited visas. Okay, minimum salary. Again, minimum salary is, yeah, I already spoke about that. Okay, so we have the quota. But the good thing is that's why it's once you was selected as part of the quota, now you're free to move your H1 to any other company. So once an employee has already been on the H1 quota, he or she is free to utilize the 6 years of H1B that have been allotted to him or her and can sort of move around.
Does that apply even if you change status from H1B to another status and then come back?
Yes, it does. It's again, so a very strict interpretation of the regulations say that you have to be on the H1 in the preceding 6 years. And if it's beyond the period of 6 years, then you may not be able to recover that lost part. But if within the period of 6 years you were ever on the H1 and now you've come back to any other visa and now you want to go back to H1, you can without being subject to the quota. So that's why getting through the quota is really important.
How long does it last?
H1s, you can be on an H1 for 6 years. That's the maximum that you can be. And you have to
Quit
eventually.
and start a business?
You can. Now the problem with, now we'll see how will you overcome the issue of an employer-employee relationship. How do you show that if you are the founder of the company, you have the authority to hire and fire yourself? Okay, so, well, what we say is, there are different ways to do it. One good way is try to see if you can partner with a US citizen. If you can have a US citizen on board who can be on the board, who can be on the board of governors or the board of directors or whatever, we can sort of establish an argument that look, after all, the company and the employee are separate entities, right? There is a corporate veil that we pierce, and I'll come back to you. And there are two distinct entities, and you have a separate body like the board of directors with the US citizen on board, and it's actually the board that has the authority to hire and fire the individual. That's an argument. We try not to tell USCIS what is the stake of the foreign national in the company, and just hope that they don't ask for it. Many times they're not sophisticated enough to do, so we get by. And it's as I said, it's grey. It's not black and white. But usually try to sort of distinguish between the company and the foreign national and say, so if you are the only person and you don't have any other employee, and you want to start your business and you don't have a co-founder, it's sort of a question mark whether the H1 will work for you or not. But if you are someone who can partner with a US citizen and can get other people on board, then maybe, yes.
Can you give an example of a high minimum salary for a startup CEO?
Okay. So I would first not call the person a CEO, okay? So I can just from broadly, like let's say in Santa Clara, okay, in California, in the Bay Area, the minimum salary even for an entry-level engineering position is about $85,000 a year. So that's prohibitive for many startups. They don't want to pay themselves that kind of money. They don't have that kind of money to sell. Most of them think they have a great idea and no money. So that's when the H1 becomes a limitation, because you have to show that you have the money. You technically, again, in regulations, you don't really have to show that the company has the money to pay the person. But again, it's about selling a good story, right? So if you don't have money, then it doesn't look good. Yes.
What does pay mean?
Salary. Pay means only salary. It doesn't mean equity. It doesn't mean stock options. It means, so the H1 actually has a salary. And you make an attestation with the Department of Labor that this person is being paid this salary for his or her, for the position that you hired for. So, yes.
Can somebody say H1 employed to company X can start a company Y, still be employed to?
No, that is what I mean when I say the visa is tied to the sponsor company.
Okay.
So many Indian nationals who are on H1s for about forever till their green cards get approved, they have this question of whether we can start our own company and work. No, you cannot. I mean, you cannot be. You can be a passive equity investor in the other company, and you should be able to demonstrate that you actually don't engage working with that company, but that again, the burden of proof is on you to be able to prove that.
H1Bs suck.
Pardon me?
H1Bs suck.
Yes.
Make it for me.
So when would that be under scrutiny? Like,
We'll talk about it later. It can be under scrutiny anytime. I mean, saying that can I do it and not get caught, that's not something that I can do.
you just said you could.
No, it will be under scrutiny when tomorrow if you apply for your naturalization, if you apply for your green card, you file your tax returns and the money you've been paid by a startup company or you were paid, remunerated at some point of time when you were on an H1 visa, then they'll come back and say, well, you were not authorized to work for that company.
How would you know like it's not a return on your investment versus it was?
So it's your burden of proof to say. If they question it, if you think you're able to convince them that yes, this is not return for work but return for investment, then maybe they buy. But the visa does not allow you to do it. That's the whole point, that the visa does not allow you to work for anybody else. Yes. Okay.
What's the minimum that the H1 is asking for? I mean, what does the sponsor company need to demonstrate that we are paying this minimum salary? What is the minimum? Is there,
You have to pay.
no, what is the is there a quantified?
Yeah, so as I said, for a software engineer, it would now, if I'm doing an H1 for a position who's sort of a CEO or at least doing his own thing, I would use the title Business Development Director because that's ultimately what you're doing, right? And Business Development Director is a specialty occupation. You require, and the salary for that, let's say in Santa Clara, it's about 110 or 115. That's the entry level salary that you're required to pay to the company if you're, yes.
So once you get the H1B visa, are you good for the next 6 years or you have to renew it?
You get it only in 3 years at a time. If you meet all conditions, you get it in 3 years and then you extend again.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
What happens if you come on a L1 and your company you came from is being sold?
That's a complex question. It depends on, it's been sold to, so you can move to the
It's not a
H1.
US company.
Yeah, you can move to the, now this is getting fact specific,
Okay.
so we can talk about it later. But let's say if the company, if the job doesn't exist, you can move to the H1, but you will be subject to the quota. So even if the new company applies for H1, you would have to apply April 1st, start working October. Okay, so let's, yeah.
I've heard it's expensive for companies to sponsor.
H1,
Yeah,
in terms of the government cost and fees.
yeah.
So the cost for doing it is about 325 plus 500 plus 750. So that's about 1500. That's it takes for a small company with less than 25 employees, and plus whatever it takes in attorney's fees and cost.
And the salary that you mentioned, does that change depending on the location of the
Yes,
position?
it does.
Okay.
Yes, it depends. So it may be different for Austin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Isn't there a requirement that the company has to pay for the H1B?
Yes.
So you cannot self-pay, right?
You cannot. You cannot self-pay. There is. So here there are some fees which is absolutely no room for doubt that the company must pay. For instance, there is a fraud protection fee that the company must pay. But there are some. So what I very strongly feel is that the company should pay for everything because the company is obligated to pay all business expenses. The company cannot get the H1 employee to pay any business expense. And I feel any fee is a business expense, so you should pay for it. Okay, so now the TN, the here is, now there is a visa for a specialty occupation which is available for nationals of Canada and Mexico. That's called the TN visa. So the requirements are pretty much the same in terms of it has to be a specialty occupation. You have to have a bachelor's degree. The only thing is that there is no question for self-employment when it comes to a TN. So you can hire a person from Canada or Mexico on a TN, or you can, if you're a Canadian or Mexican, you can work for a business, but you cannot be self-employed on TNs. The visa for extraordinary ability, the O1. Now this is really my favorite of all, if I may have
I'm sorry,
a
the
preference.
TN visa also falls into the quota that you
No,
mentioned?
the TN visa has no quota. That's a good question, and that's an advantage for a TN because if you are Canadian or Mexican and you miss the quota, you can always use the TN.
Excellent, thanks.
The TN visa does not allow you to have an immigrant intent though. So the H1 visa holders are eligible to apply for green cards, but TN visas are not.
And how long does that last? I mean, if you for some reason you don't make the quota,
You make it
the
next
TN.
year. You start working on TN, then move to the H1 next year, and then you can get a green card. Okay, so let's talk quickly about the O1 visa. The O1 visa is actually more focused on the person and less on the company. It talks about extraordinary ability individuals, those who are high achievers in the arts, sciences, or business. There is a way that you demonstrate whether they are high achievers or not. They've achieved distinction, national, international acclaim. Again, the focus, as I said, is more on the person, the ability of the person as opposed to the company. The great advantage of the O1, again, it's exempt from the quota. So the visas like T, the L1, the TN, the O1, these are visas which are not subject to the quota like the H1. So there is never a time when you have to apply and a time when it must be approved. You are eligible, free to apply for it at any time. There is again no minimum salary for, I think I've mentioned that, yes. So what it takes to succeed, that's probably the biggest question. the burden of proof that you have to show to meet eligibility for O1 is extremely high. There are a list of criterion, and you sort of have to show that the foreign national meets at least 3 of the prescribed criterion. Again, I go back to my first slide when I say be creative. There are different ways to apply this criteria to your situation. Just because it was prescribed in the regulations 40 years ago does not mean that it cannot be sort of beefed up for times today. Now, just to give you an example, published material in trade journals. Now, this is a criteria that is often used by researchers who really write articles for a living, right? Most foreign entrepreneurs don't. But what I tell them is you probably blog. So if you are able to demonstrate that the blogs that you write or the contributions that you make to journals are really followed and have millions of subscribers or viewers, I would actually equate that to a journal, right? Because techies don't write in journals, they blog. So it's just about getting creative and sort of using these same things and adapting it to the times today. Scholarly article, again, an original contribution. If you have a patent, that's an original contribution. If you've developed a product, that's an original contribution. So again, there are the different, let's say you're a membership in an association in a field where membership is only given to high achievers. Now, you may have a meetup group which is restricted to certain members who are of a certain academic or professional distinction. You can equate that to a membership in an association. So just get creative and try to see how do these criteria fit best with your profile.
Are those criteria based on the US?
Pardon me?
Are those criteria?
No, so the achievements need not be made in the US. The achievements, if you says anybody who's got national or international acclaim, if you have done something or your contributions have sort of been talked about in the local media at home, that can be one criteria. No quota, no restriction on salary. Again, you can be on the O1 indefinitely. H1's only for 6 years, but O1 can be indefinite. The O1 gives you a very quick path to a green card because you don't have to go to the traditional E2, EB3 routes. The process for getting a green card with an O1 is much faster. Again, the burden of proof is really high. So you really have to, however creative you get, you have to be an achiever. Okay, so not everybody can qualify. So this pretty much summarized the 6 non-immigrant visas that we had that we typically use either for entrepreneurs or for people who want to, US businesses who want to hire foreign nationals. I'll quickly overview the immigrant work visas and then I'll try to do the case study. So there are we'll quickly discuss these immigrant visas are green cards, permanent visas. The criteria that are mainly relevant here is the EB1. There are 2 kinds of EB1 visas. One for extraordinary ability workers, sort of mirrors the O1 that we just spoke about. The other for multinational executives and managers, which again sort of is similar to the L1 criteria. The advantage of doing the EB1, particularly for people from India and China, is that there is no waiting time. EB1s are always cut. There are always visas available. There is no backlog. There is no waiting in line for the EB1 visas. A very strict reading of the visa bulletin actually leads one to interpret that if you are a national of India, it will take you 99 years to get a green card under the EB2 route. Okay, that is a strict reading of the bulletin, assuming that nobody falls out, nobody changes criteria. So if you don't want to wait for 99 years, here's your chance. EB5, EB2s and 3s, as I said, nobody wants to wait for 99 years. EB5 is an investor-based green card. As long as you have the money to invest at least $1 million or $500,000, depending on where the investment is made. So this is not the appropriate forum to discuss the EB5. Definitely, it's an extremely complex visa. So we'll sort of quickly run by this. Okay. So this is, I wanted to get to the case study, but because I thought, yes.
If you raise money here through investors, can you apply for the EB5?
No, the EB5 investment has to come from you. It has to be your personal funds. You cannot use any investment money. So if you have property back in your country that you can sell and get, or business, so it has to be legitimate money. It's like the E2 in that sense. The money has to come from you, cannot be raised. It
Can it
be
be shown as assets? Or
yes, assets, yes, but you can't show the asset. You have to show the money. So you have to raise money. You can pledge those assets and get the funds, but there has to be money. Okay, so I just want to kind of quickly do a case study, which I think will be a fun way to sort of appreciate the various visas. We have three people, 3 individuals: Clemente from France, Mauricio from Italy, and John Paul from France. Now, Clemente, he's a French application developer. He has a bachelor's in engineering and wants to do an MBA in the US. Mauricio, he does not have any formal degree in engineering and he wants to get one in the US. And John Paul he's a technologist with a business degree and he's considering a master's in the US. Now they're working on an iPhone application, pretty much they claim will revolutionize things. They bootstrap efforts money to create a beta version and they incorporate a business entity in France. Okay? So now let's see, depending on what scenarios they choose, what are the visa options that they get. Okay, so Clemente, Mauricio, they enter the US on the visa waiver program. They participate and win $100,000. So this is the slides that you had, so pretty much it will hopefully make it easy to follow. They win $100,000 at a hackathon and they incorporate a company in the US. They meet people here, they meet a Chinese PhD student and his advisor, who's a US citizen, the PhD advisor. They meet a Spanish friend who's kind of looking out for an opportunity. The PhD advisor has contacts with VCs and can probably help them fund their money, their business. So let's see which are the options. They have multiple decisions as someone running the business. Who will be the CEO? How much money can we invest? How little can we get by? Can we get venture funding? Do we need to go to grad school, MBA school? Can we work on the business while we're in school? How do we pay ourselves? Do we pay salary, dividends? Can we have someone in France to manage the business? Can that person travel between? These are sort of the common kind of situations which most people who are dealing with a foreign business would likely face. So this is what they do. Clemente, he goes for his MBA. Mauricio, he does not think school is worth it. And John Paul just comes to the US to meet the VCs, and he gets Dr. Daring, who is a US citizen, on board. Now, just a quick visa options, any takers. Now, because Clemente comes on a visa waiver program, he does not come on the B1, right? If he decides to go to school, he cannot change his status to a student visa. He has to go back to France, get a student visa to re-enter the country. But if he had come on a B1, he could have found admission and he could have changed his status without having to leave the US. So that sort of helps you appreciate the subtle differences between two available options. Let's say he decides to he gets 12 months, he decides to go to school, and now again, because he is going for his MBA, he only gets 12 months of optional practical training, not the additional 17 that STEM students get, right? Now, what is his choices after he completes the OPT? Anybody knows why does the O1 work for him?
Because he won $100,000.
Yes, he won the 100,000. He won the hackathon. He can prove that he had people at this hackathon from all over the world, and he was one of the very few who is sort of at the top of his fields. Advantage of the O1, again, they can work for their own companies. They don't need to be paid the H1 level salary, and everybody's happy. But he can now. But here is the question. They'd rather not take the risk of filing 2 O1s. Mauricio, he does not have any other visa option but the O1. Why?
He doesn't have a degree.
He doesn't have a degree. He doesn't have a bachelor's degree. And he can only do the H1 if he had he got the bachelor's degree. So maybe Clemente can do the H1 and Mauricio can do the O1 because Maybe it's a risky, it's sort of, it's a shot to file 2 O1s and not have them approved. They rather take one and go for the O1 for the other, yes.
Would being accepted to accelerator program like Capital Factory be acceptable for the O1?
Why not? It can be. Then again, see, it's again a question of how you show it. If you say that I was accepted by Capital Factory, okay, what makes it outstanding? What makes it is how many people apply, how few people get through. So it's again selling a whole great story, right?
Can you apply 2 at the same time?
Can you apply what?
Can you apply 2 at the same time?
You can apply 2 O1s at the same time. I mean, my only concern here would be if you're both saying that you are both working for one company in a critical capacity, I would rather try and hedge your risk and say, why don't you just do 1 O and 1 H? I mean, it's a question of, it's a plan. You definitely can. There is nothing in the law that stops you from applying.
Can there be any conflicts in terms of having a dual intent? Like applying for an O1 but at the same time doing E2 to get the business off the ground?
No, not while you're applying for it. You can. See, but here, why can't you do the E2 here? Any question? Anyone?
Because they're from different countries and different.
So that's another good question. Here you have Morasio is actually Italian and who they are French. If they want to do the E2, first they are not investing any own money in their business. So that pretty much itself keeps an E2 option because you cannot be an investor, right? How would you otherwise show? So that as even if they are, we'll talk about that situation later too, but even if they do invest their business, they are people from different nationalities. So unless they are willing to give Morasio a 50% stake in the business, they cannot do the E2. Okay, so now you sort of can get a sense of why, Jean Paul is great. He's on the visa waiver program. He's coming to do a legit activity. He can later on move to the H1B because he has a bachelor's degree. Problems, what are the problems with H1B if any of them do decide to go for the H1B? The problem is again, how do you show employer-employee relationship when there are 3 foreign nationals on board? Maybe a good way to do is get Dr. Daring, who is a US citizen, on board. That way you might be able to make it easier for yourself to be establish an employer-employee relationship and sort of hopefully get the H1 working if the other options don't. So again, this is just again an idea of how, as I said, small changes in the way in facts can affect the options that are available to you. Yes.
Question. Those scholarships like work for O1 work somehow, are they valued?
Again, as I said, see, the criteria is laid down in just 10 sentences. It's really up to you or whoever is preparing your case to argue it as creatively as you can. Right? So, I mean, there are incubators and accelerators there which are very prestigious. If I was to argue with anybody, I would say, like, look, this is a very prestigious incubator program. So many X people apply, only a small percentage get through. So it really depends on how well can you make your case. Which again, to be fair, it's a very high burden of proof. So there's a possibility that your case is not approved. But again, if you are like Morasio who never went to school, you don't have an option, right? So,
Extraordinary talent.
yes. So now, again, the 3 do not invest their own money in the business. But here's a twist. Here, Jean Paul actually gets French venture funding in the business. So there is money in the business. Now that there is business, you think the E2 works here? Probably it does. If the VC is owning about 50% of the business, right? So it is a French business. It is qualifying for the treaty, but you will not come as let's say Clemente will not come as an investor, or Jean Paul will not come as an investor. They'll come as critical employees. They'll come as managers, or they'll come as executives. Yes.
So it doesn't matter that the VC is taking a percentage of the equity, like 20%.
I mean, if it's okay with you and you can, if it's the VC equity is only to establish ownership, the nationality of the company.
So it does count for nationality.
It counts towards nationality. Yes, it counts towards
What if
nationality.
it's like US investment?
No, so then you are not. Then it's not a treaty. Then you cannot do the E. It has to be. Okay, so it has, again, it can, it cannot be any other country. If you are a Danish citizen, you cannot get money from Sweden, even though whatever, it may be a Scandinavian group, but it has to be the same country, otherwise nationality does not match, yes.
If you get more than, let's say, $500,000 external funding in the US, can you use it for the O1 special ability to, I don't know,
No, you cannot get yourself ability just because you've got funding, but what you can do is, it makes a stronger case for an H1. Because then you can show more bona fides within the company. You can show that the company is sort of, see, the moment you get VC stake, you can argue that there is some other entity which is now responsible for controlling, hiring, firing, whatever. So you sort of try other options. So again, now let's say he drops out, Clemente drops out of school. Okay, so, okay, this can't join the company unless, after school, he will probably have 29 months of OPT. So if they really cannot find the E working for them, they can use this 29 months period to sort of work for their company. Clemente can be an E2 employee as long as the company is 50% owned by French nationals. Now, here's another thing. Now, because Clemente and John Paul, they are all French, let's say you do not want to give Mauricio a 50% stake in the company. You decide each of them keeps one third. So what do? Mauricio, if he decides to go for a formal education, once he completes his school, you can have him work on an OPT with a minor stake in the company. So that he at that point does not work for you. If John Paul continues to be in France, he can come on the L1 after 1 year. He has the option to sort of, you set up the US entity now, have him continue working in France for 1 year to manage the business. Maybe grow you have a couple of people to take care of the business there. And then John Paul can come here on the L1. See, the other interesting thing about the L1 is that the relationship between the two companies, that need not exist in the preceding 1 year or 3 years. The relationship needs to be existing when you are applying, as opposed to the employment requirement. So the foreign national, the L1 beneficiary, has to be working for at least 1 year out of the preceding 3 years, right? But the affiliate relationship can exist today and you can apply tomorrow. So you can always buy out a stake in a company here, create that affiliate relationship, and then send an employee here on the L1. So you do not have to have that affiliate relationship for a certain period of time before you move employees within the company. If that makes sense. Okay. Again, now if they do invest money in the business, if the three of them are actually investing funds, it can be an E2 for all as long as business is owned and controlled equally by nationals of both countries. You can do an H1 for anyone, and as long as you have one citizen on board, like maybe the VC or the PhD advisor or whoever, the H1 does not have a majority stake, the H1B can work for all of them. O1 for Clemente and Mauricio is always possible because the O1 is, as I said, their hackathon made things easy for them. And in all scenarios, Santiago, who was your Mexican buddy, he can work for them on TN, even though he cannot join them on a TN, but he might be able to do an E2, but again, then there is a problem with multiple nationalities if you have now 3 or 4 nationalities. So I sort of deliberately kept that out of it. This pretty much.
What was that one for H1B? What was that one USC on the board of directors?
So here is the USC. As I mentioned, that the employer-employee relationship for the H1 is a challenge, right? You need to establish that the employee is going to be controlled, supervised, managed by the company. So how do you get an employer-employee relationship? If you have someone in the company on the board of directors of the company or an advisor, and again remember, the board of director or the advisor does not have to be paid. If they're willing to give you advice for free, then they can pretty much be a part of your board, or they can have an equity stake in the company. But it sort of helps to put an application together which says that there is someone else who is going to have authority to hire or fire or manage or supervise the H1 employee.
So you're, just to clarify, board of directors did not have equity stake?
It's up to you. How do you want to compensate or remunerate your board? That's
another question. So the guy, so say guy with H1, what if he has a major equity stake?
So that's what ideally I would not, that is not going to be preferable, but let's put it this way. You are not obligated to sort of, unless if USAI comes back and asks you how much stake does the company have, if the guy has in him, and if he has a majority stake, that might really go against you, that might not really work for you, but that's pretty much what you
And
thought.
you won't expose yourself, right? Like you won't tell by yourself that.
You needn't. There is no way, you're not obligated to. There is no requirement that you have to, but if they come back and ask for it, then you will, right? But you may just get lucky and they don't come back and ask for it, so that's the best that you can do. Yes.
Can you give me an idea of how long it would take from the moment I file my papers for an O1 visa? How long it would take for them to?
So currently, it's taking 15 days for someone to get approved.
That's it?
Yes, it's getting, that's the government processing time from the time that you file it. But I would say it takes, for a good O1 petition, it takes about 3 to 4 weeks to get it done, to get it up and ready. And the approval time that it's taking, O1s are going really fast. I mean, O1s are taking about 15 days to get approved.
If they deny most of them.
If you get denied, you usually if you get a request for evidence, meaning that you, maybe they come back and ask you for more information. And if they do, then the processing time keeps changing. That information is actually available on the USAID's website. So, but currently it's taking about 15 days.
How brilliant is brilliant for because I've talked to some immigration lawyers and they've mentioned that they've had a client that had an Oscar in one of the lesser categories like
So-
lighting and they didn't get approved. So
I mean, that's the whole challenge with it. I mean, it's not, there is no, checklist which says if you, so there are two alternatives. So either you get the Nobel. If you haven't got the Nobel, then you must meet one of the 3 of these 10 criteria.
it's kind of a crapshoot, really.
I mean, I would again say it's not easy, but it's definitely let's say if you're an entrepreneur, you've managed to start something and you've managed to sell it or somebody have it acquired by another company and got paid decently for it. It's again how smartly you argue, how creatively you argue, and that may just be the only shot.
How good is the lawyer?
What else there is to it? Yes. Any other questions? Excuse me. Yeah.
I've been on F1 a STEM student and used my 29 months. Can I get the 29 months again if I join F1?
If you join the new program, yes. If you're joining if you take up a newer master's or you could do a same program, then each program that you do will come with its set of 12 months.
Like you have to be in different.
So you have to elevate that level
You
of
cannot
your
do this.
program.
If you have a master's, you cannot do a master's.
You might have to do your PhD and you sort of elevate your education to a higher level to be able to get that.
If I'm not wrong, you can't use this additional 17 months another time. You have only one.
The 17th STEM extension, that is available only. But the OPT option of 12 months is available whenever you are upgrading the program.
Does the JD count towards the 20,000 extra?
No, it's not a master's, right?
It's more than a master's, it's a doctorate.
So what you do is the JD
You have
is
like
not.
the doctorate as
The lawyer.
Pardon?
JD is lawyer.
Yeah, the JD is a.
JD is kind of a bachelor's in law, then there's an LLM which is a
If
master's.
you do an LLM, which is the master's, then you get the additional 20,000 numbers, not with JD.
So and the 20,000 is for any major.
Any major, as long as it's from a US university.
Okay. So it's US universities and masters are allowed.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Have you filed any cap exempt petitions, cap exempt H-1B petitions between private companies and research organizations or nonprofits?
I will not talk about work. I mean, I don't want to discuss what I've filed or not. We can talk about it later. But yes, you can be, an employer can be cap exempt. If you're affiliated to a non-profit or you're affiliated to a research organization or an educational, those are situations when the H1s can be cap exempt. So it's possible, yes. Yeah.
Are there any special cases for Australian citizens? Is it just
E3s. You have an a visa called E3. It's like the TN again, the specialty. It's a specialty occupation visa which is only available to Australian nationals.
Okay.
That's again exempt from the quota. So.
I had a question. I don't know. I kind of might have missed if you had a discussion on E5.
EB5s?
Yeah, EB5s. like the money which when you make a case for that, how long your business or has to be working in America for that matter?
It's 2 years. I mean, you have to show that you meet the business meets all those eligibility requirements within 2 years. Then your green card is moved from a conditional to a permanent green card. But you have to show it for at least.
Oh, there's something called a conditional. Like how do you get a conditional?
You have to put in that kind of money.
Okay. And so can that money be earned in America and then be invested? Say for an H-1B, I haven't.
No, the money has to come from overseas.
Okay.
Yes.
Are you subject to a H-1B visa quota more than once?
So it depends. If you have already exhausted your 6 years of H1.
No, I'm in the 6 years limit. So I was in an H1, moved to an H4, and I'm trying to get back to an H1.
So long as you've not exhausted your 6 years, you can be exempt from the quota. But the moment you exhaust your 6 years and you don't have any other way to extend your H1, you have to leave the country, stay out for 1 year, and then re-enter, and then you will be exempt from the quota.
Okay. And one last question. In that last case where there was a US citizen on the board, would it be detrimental anyway if you have a family relative as a US citizen on the board? Or
I mean, there's nothing in the law which says that the relative can't be there or anything, but the whole idea here, as I'm saying, it's not it's how legitimate or how convincing your case sounds. If you have a good product, if you have a good plan, if you have money, if you're ready to fund it, you're able to demonstrate. These are some ways that we just sort of try to overcome the traditional paradigms of an H1 visa. So traditionally it required an employer-employee relationship, but with entrepreneurs, this sort of situation on the equation gets different. So we just sort of come up with, as we say, creative ways to overcome traditional burdens. Yes. Anyone else?
You mentioned the TN at the same time as the H-1B. The 6 years also apply for
No,
the TN?
TNs can be on TNs indefinitely.
Okay.
You can be on the TN visa forever, pretty much. I mean, as long as you continue to meet the eligibility.
It's also 3 years.
Increments, yes. You are given it in increments of 3 years.
And does that one have the same cost for the company as the H-1B you mentioned around?
No, the cost is not necessarily the same. You don't have the fraud protection fee. There are certain fees that are not associated with the TN that are associated with the H1.
Okay.
But the requirements are pretty much more or less the same.
Do you have offices here in Austin or you're just in Santa Clara?
I'm based in Santa Clara.
So the people who win that will have to go to Santa Clara or you?
No, I mean you can, if you want to, as I said, immigration is a federal practice. So you pretty much can work with any attorney anywhere in the US. But you can, if you have any questions, you can visit my website. It has a lot of videos on all the visas that we've talked about. There's a lot of useful information, resources. So, and feel free to send me an email or question and drop your business cards definitely if you want a free consultation that you can utilize within the next 6 months. You may not be starting your companies today, but maybe in the next 6 months. So, is that about it? Thank you so much. I hope you guys have a